There is an instruction in a will written in 1809 on a property in the Bohemian Alps that for decades no one could explain. Just one line. Let no one open the room on the third floor while Elias lives. Elias died that same year. In 1810, the room was finally opened. Inside, there was no gold, no weapons, no political conspiracy or state secret. There was a dark wooden chest, and inside the chest, 47 handwritten pages by a woman named Greta, the nanny of the von Kessler family, who had died decades before. The last 10 pages repeated the same sentence, always the same, with handwriting that grew more unsteady with every line, as if the hand trembled more each time. He knows. He always knew. And yet he kept on smiling. Who was Elias? What did he know? And why was smiling, in this context, the most disturbing thing he could possibly have done? To understand that, you need to go back to the winter of 1743. You need to walk into Kessler Castle, in the Bohemian Alps, the territory that is today the Czech Republic. And you need to understand that what happened there was not a deviation of madness. It was, in a certain way, a cold and calculated choice, made within a logic that the 18th century considered perfectly rational. That is what makes this story impossible to forget. If you feel that the world holds secrets that most people are afraid to face, you have found your place. Don't let this story be lost to oblivion. Subscribe now to keep the flames of curiosity burning. Leave your like if you believe the truth is stranger than fiction. And comment "I watched," so I know you made it here with me. To understand Count Albrecht von Kessler, you need to understand the world he lived in. And that world had an obsession that today seems almost impossible to grasp in its intensity. The name, the title, the bloodline. In the Holy Roman Empire of the 18th century, nobility was not merely a matter of social prestige. It was a matter of legal survival. Titles and properties were not simply inherited. They were regulated by imperial decrees that determined, with bureaucratic precision, who could receive what and under which conditions. The imperial succession decree and its regional variations applied in territories like Bohemia under Habsburg rule established an inexorable rule. In the absence of a direct and legitimate male heir, noble properties and titles would revert to the crown. Not to cousins, not to daughters, to the crown. This was not a distant abstraction. It was a blade at the throat of any aristocrat who did not have a son. And Count Albrecht von Kessler in 1743 did not have a son. What he had was a 19-year-old daughter named Margaret. Intelligent, educated in the molds of Austrian aristocracy, fluent in 3 languages. She was even promised to a certain Baron Voss, a marriage that would have been perfectly adequate, perfectly safe, perfectly useless for the Count's purposes. Because a marriage to Baron Voss would transfer Margaret, and with her, any future inheritance, to the Voss family. The Kessler bloodline would end. Albrecht could not accept that. And here is the point that most narratives about this kind of case ignore. He was not necessarily a man of vile instincts. He was a man of an era in which the family name was treated as a living entity, almost sacred, that transcended the individuals who carried it. That does not absolve him, but it explains the mental architecture that led him to what would follow. Because when the system offers no legitimate way out, some people create their own. And the exits that powerful people create, when they operate without accountability, tend to be deeply destructive for everyone around them, except for themselves. Can you imagine for a moment the weight of that winter of 1743 on Margaret, 19 years old? A marriage promise she was likely awaiting as a form of escape. And then her father calls her for a conversation in his study, closes the door, and begins to explain his solution. We don't know the exact words of that conversation. Greta's diary was not present in that moment. But we know the result. And the result tells us everything about the words that were spoken. Father Dominic Haas was known in the region as a man of solid faith and fragile finances. There were debts. There was a brother with problems that needed to be resolved with money. There was, above all, the awareness that Count Kessler was the largest financial supporter of the local diocese, and that his generosity was not unconditional. We don't know whether Albrecht directly threatened the priest or simply presented the situation as a transaction. The documents compiled by Baron Voss decades later suggest that Dominic Haas was summoned to the castle in November 1743, and that, after that visit, he made a considerable deposit into an ecclesiastical account that corresponded to no recorded donation. That tells us something about the nature of power. It rarely needs explicit threats. Often, it is enough to make the alternative sufficiently costly. The ceremony took place in December of 1743, on a Wednesday, at 3 in the morning. The small private chapel of Kessler Castle was not decorated for the occasion. There were no flowers. There was no music. Those present were four: Count Albrecht, Margaret, Father Dominic, and the nanny Greta, who was woken in the middle of the night, forcibly brought from her bed, and told that if she ever spoke of what she witnessed, she would be dismissed without references, without back pay, without any prospect of employment in a region where the Count knew every employer. Greta was 52 years old. She had raised Margaret since her earliest years. She loved that girl like a daughter, and she stayed silent. What she wrote in her diary about that night does not describe the act itself. She uses no direct words. Perhaps because there were no words she was capable of writing. What she describes is Margaret. She stared at the candle flame throughout the entire ceremony. She did not blink once. She did not cry. She did not speak beyond what was asked of her. I understood in that moment that she had gone somewhere inside herself, a place where this was not happening, a place where she was still the girl I had taught to read, sitting by the library window with the afternoon light in her hair. The marriage records were filed under false names. Albrecht used the identity of an already deceased cousin, someone who no longer existed to contradict anything. The priest signed. The book was stored in a sealed box that Albrecht kept in his personal study until his death. Legally, that marriage was invisible. Morally, it was inexorable. Margaret was 19 years old, and her fate had been decided not by her, not by any human law that protected her, but by the intersection of a father's greed, a priest's corruption, and a system that treated women as instruments of patrimonial transfer. You need to pause here for a moment and consider. This was not an anomaly. Forced marriages, marriages of convenience that completely ignored the woman's will, and manipulation of documentation to circumvent inconvenient laws were documented practices across 18th century Europe, especially among the aristocracy. What set the Kessler case apart was not the mechanism, it was the degree. It was the identity of the parties involved, and it was what would come next. 9 months later, Elias was born. The Count registered the child as the son of an anonymous knight in service of the Kessler household. Another layer of falsification, another carefully constructed entry to create distance between reality and paper. But paper has no eyes, and Elias's eyes were Albrecht's eyes. Everyone on the property knew. The servants, the farmers on the neighboring lands, the merchants who visited the castle. The secret existed only in the documents. In real life, it was a collective silence sustained by fear and economic dependence. Elias grew up in an environment that was, on its surface, perfectly appropriate for a young 18th century aristocrat. A rigorous education. Latin, philosophy, mathematics, fencing, estate management. The Count, his biological father, raised as grandfather, invested in the boy's formation with an intensity that the tutors described as almost anxious, as if he needed to be certain that Elias would be capable enough to carry the name. Margaret lived in the castle until 1771, when the Count died. In the records that survived from that period, letters, household orders, purchase registers, her name appears dozens of times, always in functional contexts. Never in a personal letter, never in a mention that suggests a documented maternal relationship. Greta wrote about this too. Lady Margaret did not embrace Elias, not because she did not love him. I know she did, in a way I was never quite able to name. But it was a love she kept so deep inside that it looked like anger to those who did not know the story. When he cut his knee playing, she would look at the wound with an expression that was neither worry nor indifference. It was as if she were seeing something else. When Albrecht died in 1771, Elias was 27 years old and was technically the heir of everything: titles, lands, responsibilities. The will was executed without complications. The falsification had worked with technical perfection. Margaret left 3 weeks later for a convent in Salzburg. She had personally financed the construction of a new wing of the convent years earlier, as if she had been preparing for this escape in advance. She lived 17 more years. She died in 1788, in a silence that the convent records describe only as pious resignation. She never spoke publicly about Elias. She never wrote to him, as far as anyone knows. She never returned. And Elias, who had grown up calling the Count grandfather, who had been raised inside a carefully constructed fiction, managed the Kessler lands for 4 decades. He was described as an efficient administrator, a fair negotiator, a man of few words but considerable presence. The peasants respected him. Some feared him slightly, the way one fears something one does not fully understand. He smiled at everyone, wrote a contemporary in a letter from 1790, but his eyes seemed to look through people, as if he could see something standing behind them, as if he knew something you did not, and had decided, for his own reasons, not to tell you. But what was that something? In 1781, Elias was 38 years old. He was inspecting a storage room of old documents in the castle, one of the periodic administrative tasks, when he found a chest that appeared in no inventory. Inside was Greta's diary. We don't know how long he took to read it. We don't know whether there were tears, rage, collapse, or none of those things. What we know, because Baron Voss carefully documented the testimonies of servants still living at the time of the 1810 investigation, is what happened the following morning. Elias came down for breakfast at his usual time. He ate normally. He gave instructions about the harvest to the foreman. He answered correspondence. And then he went to the 3rd floor, placed the chest with the diary in a room that was being used for storing old furniture, locked the door, and kept the key. He did not destroy the documents. He did not reveal them. He did not seek out Father Dominic, who had died years earlier in any case. He did not travel to Salzburg to confront his mother. He simply sealed them away and kept on living. For 38 more years. This is where the story of Elias von Kessler separates itself from every other case that could be superficially compared to it. Because when we think about stories of revealed family secrets, and literature, history, and journalism are full of them, we tend to expect a reaction. Confrontation or collapse, revenge or destruction. The narrative template we carry, built across centuries of stories about traumatic discoveries, tells us that revelation requires an explosion. Elias did not explode. And that is what the peasants could not understand. It is what Baron Voss, in 1810, with all his investigative methodology, admitted he could not fully explain. It is what made Greta repeat that sentence 10 times, with increasingly unsteady handwriting. He knows. He always knew, and yet he kept on smiling. There was something Greta knew and wrote only once, in the middle pages of the diary, almost like a confession she did not want to leave too visible. When Elias was 13, he asked me why his mother never touched him. I did not know what to say. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You don't need to tell me. I know there is something you cannot say." "That's all right, Greta. I have already understood that some things need to stay where they are." He was 13 years old. 13 years old. Elias had not waited for the chest. Elias had somehow built an understanding, perhaps incomplete, perhaps intuitive, of the weight that lay over that family long before he had access to any document. Children who grow up inside family secrets often develop this ability. They notice the silences, notice the averted glances, notice the pauses in conversation that last 1 second longer than they should. They know there is something. They learn to navigate around that something without naming it. And when the name is finally revealed, the reaction is often not surprise. It is quiet confirmation. So that was it. Baron Voss, who had been Margaret's rejected suitor decades earlier, and who therefore had personal reasons to want to understand what had destroyed that family, arrived at a conclusion that sits in the last page of his 1810 report. The Count did not destroy his family out of malice. He destroyed it out of an absolute belief that the name was worth more than any person who carried it. And the most terrible thing of all is that the system around him, legal, ecclesiastical, social, provided him with every tool necessary to do this without anyone ever formally stopping him. Stop and think about that sentence. Because it is not only about Count Albrecht von Kessler, it is about any system that places the perpetuation of an institution, whether a name, a company, a tradition, a regime, above the well-being of the individuals who compose it. That tells us something about 1743, and it tells us something about today as well. Elias died in 1809, without heirs. He left all properties to a religious order, perhaps as a silent echo of the choice his mother had made when she left for the convent. The will contained only one unusual instruction. You already know which one. When the room was opened in 1810, the investigator sent by Baron Voss found something beyond the chest and the diary. He found a chair positioned in front of the window, facing the landscape outside, the Alps, the morning mist, the lands that had been Kessler for generations. In the chair, there were marks of use, wear on the fabric. The chair had been used regularly by someone who sat there often for a very long time. Elias had locked that room, but he had kept the key for himself. No one knows what he did there, whether he reread the diary, whether he simply sat, whether he wept or prayed, or simply remained in silence, looking out at the same mountains his father had looked at, that his mother had looked at, that Greta had looked at before she died. But he returned. Continuously, over decades, he opened that door, walked into that room, and sat with the truth. And then he walked out, came down the stairs, and smiled at everyone. That is the detail I cannot shake when I think about this story. Not the monstrosity of the original act, which was real and terrible and must not be minimized, but what that monstrosity produced in the next generation. A man who found a way to carry an unbearable knowledge without being destroyed by it, and without destroying others with it either. Elias did not seek public judgment. He did not write memoirs. He did not reveal the secret to tarnish his father's memory or to explain his mother's absence. He chose silence, not cowardly silence, but the silence of someone who decided that some wounds do not heal through exposure, that some truths belong to a locked room, and that what matters is to keep coming down the stairs. We can debate whether that was the right choice. There were likely victims, beyond Margaret, who would have deserved the truth to come to light while they still lived. Father Dominic was never held accountable. The Count died respected. The structure that made all of it possible remained intact. Elias's silence protected himself as much as it protected the memory of those who could no longer be protected. What this story leaves us, more than 250 years later, is not a simple lesson. It is not a fable's moral. It is a question. When a system produces the monster, when the laws, the institutions, and the economic incentives collaborate to make the horrible possible, even logical, where does the responsibility lie? With the individual who chose? With the system that allowed it? With all those who stayed silent, out of fear or dependence, and who, with that silence, made silence the only language available? Margaret survived. Elias survived. Greta survived. But what each of them carried inside is a form of destruction that appears in no official record. There is no line in a Prague archive that documents the weight of a worn chair in front of a locked window. The peasants of the region say that on cold winter nights, a light appears in the third-floor window. The room no one locks anymore. We explored the shadows together today, but the mystery never ends. Your subscription is what allows these voices from the past to keep being heard. Click the subscribe button so you're not left in the dark for the next video. Leave your like as a tribute to the search for truth. And share your darkest theory in the comments. What do you think Elias felt, sitting in that chair, looking out at the mountains? I read and reply to every single one of you, inhabitants of this channel.